40,000 years ago, a disappearance reshaped the entire human story. For more than 300,000 years, Neanderthals had survived in Ice Age Europe, thriving in conditions that would break modern humans within hours. They were powerful, intelligent, and deeply adapted to the cold. Yet, in the span of a few thousand years, barely a blink in evolutionary time, they vanished completely, leaving behind caves, tools, and a mystery that would haunt scientists for centuries. To understand why their extinction remains one of the greatest puzzles in human evolution, we must first understand who they really were. Early depictions painted Neanderthals as clumsy, slow, almost animal-like. But modern research shows the opposite. They had larger brains than Homo sapiens, crafted sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire with skill, and organized themselves into small but resilient family groups. Their bones were thick and muscular, their lungs large, their build compact and incredibly strong. Everything about their bodies was engineered for survival in a frozen world. For hundreds of millennia, they endured dramatic shifts in climate. Glaciers advanced and retreated, forests turned into tundra, then returned once more. Animals migrated, disappeared, reappeared. Through all of it, Neanderthals adapted. They hunted massive Ice Age animals like woolly rhinos, giant elk, and bison. They knew the rhythm of seasons and the movement of herds. They were survivors in every sense, until something changed that they could not overcome. Around 45,000 years ago, another human species entered Europe, Homo sapiens. They were physically smaller and more slender, but carried advantages that would reshape the continent. Sapiens created tools with more precision, used weapons capable of striking from a distance, and formed larger, more cooperative groups. They shared knowledge across clans, creating cultural networks that stretched hundreds of miles. In an unstable climate, these traits became decisive. The arrival of Homo sapiens did not immediately mean conflict. In fact, the first interactions between the two species may have been peaceful. They recognized each other as human. They exchanged knowledge. They even formed families, clear from the DNA still carried by billions of people today. But cooperation did not erase competition. As climate swings intensified, food sources became uncertain. Large animals grew scarce, forcing both species to explore new hunting grounds and new strategies. In this race for resources, the strengths of sapiens began to outweigh those of Neanderthals. Neanderthal populations were always small, perhaps never exceeding 60,000 individuals across all of Eurasia. With such low numbers, even minor disruptions could have massive effects. A bad winter, a failed hunting season, the loss of a small population group, all could push them closer to collapse. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens reproduced faster, moved farther, and maintained wider social ties. As sapiens expanded, Neanderthals were gradually pushed into more isolated, less resource-rich regions. The archaeology of the final Neanderthal centuries paints a painful picture. Many skeletons show signs of malnutrition, especially in children. Tooth enamel carries marks of starvation. Tool sites contain fewer artifacts. Caves, once filled with signs of daily life, show reduced activity. Their world was shrinking, not suddenly, but slowly, with each passing generation. And yet, extinction was not a single event. It was the result of overlapping pressures: climate instability, competition for resources, genetic isolation, and a rapidly changing environment that rewarded adaptability over specialization. For a species perfectly tuned to Ice Age Europe, rapid shifts in climate created challenges their small, scattered populations could not overcome. When sapiens arrived with new tools, wider networks, and flexible survival strategies, the balance tipped even further. Still, the most surprising truth is this: Neanderthals never fully disappeared. When the two species met, they interbred. Today, every person outside Africa carries 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Their physical bodies vanished, but their genetic legacy lives on inside us. Quiet, permanent proof that they were not failures of evolution, but part of who we are. As we explore their final millennia, a haunting question remains. How could a species so strong, so intelligent, and so enduring fall just as our ancestors rose? The answer lies in the fragile intersection between environment, biology, and the unforgiving mathematics of small populations, forces that shaped not only their fate, but our own place in the human story. As we move deeper into the Neanderthal world, we begin to see how their final era was shaped not just by strength or intelligence, but by the fragile balance between environment and survival. Their lives were intertwined with the rhythms of Ice Age Europe. Every migration of animals, every shift in climate, every scarcity of plants or prey had a direct impact on their chances of living through another season. For thousands of generations, they navigated these challenges with remarkable resilience. But in their last millennia, the environment they depended on began to change faster than their small populations could adapt. The climate shifts of 40,000 to 50,000 years ago were unlike anything their ancestors had faced before. Sudden drops in temperature created long, brutal winters. Warm periods came unpredictably, melting ice and transforming landscapes in only decades. Forests vanished. Open plains expanded. Rivers froze. Animals that Neanderthals once relied on, the massive herbivores that fed entire clans, began disappearing from the archaeological record. The loss of these key species wasn't gradual. It struck like a series of shocks, each one shrinking the available food supply. For a species with limited numbers and tightly knit groups, this instability was devastating. Neanderthals hunted with close-range weapons, relying on teamwork, strength, and precise knowledge of animal behavior. Their tools worked well for ambushing large prey, but were less effective for small, fast-moving animals that became more common as megafauna declined. The environment was changing, but their hunting strategies, and the cultural knowledge behind them, had been shaped over hundreds of thousands of years. Innovation was possible, but slow. When the climate changed faster than their traditions, they faced shortages they could not easily recover from. At the same time, Homo sapiens expanded steadily across the continent. They used lighter projectiles, long-distance weapons, and more efficient group coordination. Their ability to communicate complex ideas through language gave them an edge in organizing hunts, planning migrations, and adapting to new food sources. While Neanderthals remained masters of their traditional territories, sapiens moved across landscapes with a flexibility unmatched in human history. In a period defined by rapid climate swings, this flexibility became a decisive advantage. But the story is not simply one of competition. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that Neanderthals and sapiens lived close enough at times to interact peacefully. They likely exchanged tools, learned techniques from one another, and even formed mixed families. These interactions show that Neanderthals were far from primitive. They recognized opportunity, formed alliances, and navigated complicated social landscapes. Yet cooperation did not remove the fundamental challenge. Their numbers were too small. Small populations face a unique vulnerability. Every injury, every harsh winter, every unsuccessful hunt has a larger impact. A clan of 20 Neanderthals losing just 3 or 4 members could collapse within a generation. Rebuilding population numbers required long periods of stability that simply did not exist anymore. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens maintained broader networks. When one group suffered, they could merge with another, share resources, or move to a new region. Neanderthals, isolated in smaller clusters, had no such buffer. The psychological toll of scarcity also left its mark. Sites from their final centuries reveal increased signs of stress, hurried tool-making, fewer ornaments, and less evidence of symbolic behavior. This doesn't mean they lost intelligence. Rather, it shows they were overwhelmed by survival challenges. When every day is a struggle for food, there is little time left for rituals, creativity, or teaching new generations the skills that once defined their culture. Even so, Neanderthals did not give up. They adapted to shrinking territories, altered hunting methods, and moved into smaller ecological niches. Some groups survived far longer than scientists once believed, living in remote refuges such as Gibraltar and southwestern Europe. Their persistence proves they were incredibly capable, but the forces against them, climate chaos, resource competition, population decline, and genetic isolation, were too powerful together. Their extinction was not a single event. It was a slow unraveling, a long period during which each generation faced slightly greater challenges than the one before. By the time Homo sapiens became the dominant human species in Europe, the Neanderthals had already been weakened by centuries of cumulative strain. Yet their story does not end with disappearance. The truth hidden inside modern DNA proves that Neanderthals did not vanish completely. They became part of us, woven into the genetic fabric of every human outside Africa. Their immune genes, their adaptations to cold, their biological strengths live on quietly inside billions of people today. In a way, we are the last chapter of their story. To understand the disappearance of Neanderthals, we must step into the unstable world they faced during their final millennia, a world shaped by some of the most dramatic climate shifts in human history. The last ice age was not a single long freeze, but a sequence of violent swings between warm and cold phases. These rapid transitions, known as Dansgaard-Oeschger events, could transform Europe's environment in as little as a few centuries, sometimes even decades. For species with large populations, such swings were difficult. For Neanderthals, who lived in small, scattered groups, they were catastrophic. Imagine forests that once offered shelter suddenly replaced by open, wind-scoured plains, rivers that provided water freezing solid for months, herds of massive animals that Neanderthals had hunted for thousands of years, migrating hundreds of miles away, or disappearing entirely. In these chaotic cycles, entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed again and again. Neanderthals, adapted to cold but not to unpredictability, found the world they mastered slipping out of balance. Their survival strategies worked beautifully when landscapes changed slowly. Their bodies were optimized for close-range hunting, steady patterns of prey movement, and familiar territories passed down across generations. But as climate shocks intensified, the animals they relied on, giant elk, woolly rhinos, steppe bison, became harder to find. Many of these species declined due to shrinking habitats and disrupted food chains. For Neanderthals, who specialized in large prey hunting, this loss was not just inconvenient, it was existential. Archaeological evidence reveals the consequences. In several late Neanderthal sites, bones of prey animals appear smaller and more fragile, suggesting they were forced to hunt younger, less nutritious animals. Some layers show fewer tools, fewer fire pits, and fewer signs of long-term settlement. These clues hint at rising mobility and increasing desperation as Neanderthals chased food through a changing landscape. Even their teeth carry the story. Many individuals from their final period show enamel defects, indicators of famine during childhood. Climate wasn't a distant abstract force. It directly shaped their health and survival. While Neanderthals struggled with diminishing prey, Homo sapiens entered Europe with strategies better suited for unpredictability. Sapiens hunted both large and small animals, gathered diverse plant foods, and built tools adaptable to different environments. When forests disappeared, they shifted tactics. When plains expanded, they developed new weapons like long-range projectiles. Their flexibility came from innovation and communication, traits that allowed them to adjust within a generation rather than over many centuries. This contrast is critical. Neanderthals lived in small communities that were tight-knit and stable, but limited in the spread of new ideas. If a single group failed to adapt to a sudden environmental change, that cultural knowledge vanished with them. Sapiens, however, maintained larger networks. Ideas traveled, innovations spread, survival strategies could be exchanged across hundreds of miles. In a climate defined by instability, this ability to share information became a powerful evolutionary tool. Climate also affected reproduction. Harsh winters shortened food supply seasons, making it harder for Neanderthal mothers to carry pregnancies safely. Stress, malnutrition, and disease reduced birth rates in any population. But for one already small, every lost infant had a tremendous impact. Genetic studies suggest that Neanderthal numbers were so low in their final thousands of years that even a slight drop in reproductive success could push them toward extinction. The climate didn't just threaten their food, it threatened their ability to maintain a stable population. As Ice Age swings continued, Neanderthal groups were forced to migrate into smaller pockets of habitable land, refugia, where conditions remained survivable. These regions offered temporary safety, but isolation made populations even more vulnerable. With fewer individuals, genetic diversity declined. Diseases spread more easily. A single harsh decade could eliminate an entire group. By contrast, sapiens moved fluidly through vast territories, maintaining connections and supporting one another during environmental stress. Despite all these challenges, Neanderthals showed remarkable resilience. They adapted to colder climates far better than Homo sapiens initially could. They learned to survive with less, travel longer distances, and endure extreme winters. Their bodies were living testaments to Ice Age mastery. But mastery wasn't enough when the rules of the environment changed too quickly. Specialization became a trap, and adaptability became the key to survival. The final centuries of Neanderthals reveal a species slowly pushed to the edge by environmental instability. Their once rich hunting grounds turned barren. Their traditional knowledge lost its reliability. Their small populations lacked the genetic resilience to withstand repeated shocks. Climate did not kill them in a single blow. It wore them down, generation after generation, until survival became an impossible race against time. And yet, climate alone cannot explain everything. Even as the world changed, Neanderthals might have endured, if not for the arrival of another human species whose strengths amplified every one of their weaknesses. The real turning point came when climate instability collided with direct competition for the same resources. As the climate continued to shift in unpredictable cycles, the world Neanderthals depended on was gradually breaking apart. But it wasn't only the loss of prey or the shrinking forests that pushed them toward collapse. It was the increasing frequency of these changes. A species may survive one drought, or one migration collapse, or one severe winter. But when those environmental shocks strike again and again across a few generations, even the most resilient populations reach a breaking point. Neanderthal life had always been tightly connected to their landscape. They knew every river crossing, every migration path, every cliff where herds would funnel during seasonal movements. This intimate knowledge came from thousands of years of living in the same territories. But when the Ice Age began oscillating more violently, those patterns no longer held. Trails disappeared under ice. Prey migrated into unfamiliar regions. Some prey never returned at all. The traditional strategies that had sustained Neanderthals for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly became unreliable. This forced them into a painful cycle of constant relocation. Archaeological sites from the final Neanderthal period show shorter occupation layers, evidence that groups were staying for only brief periods before moving on. Camps became temporary, tools more hastily produced. Instead of living in stable home territories, Neanderthals were now chasing a moving target, always trying to catch up to the environment that once worked in their favor. These frequent relocations came with heavy costs. Moving meant greater exposure to predators, injuries, and harsh weather. It meant less time for building shelters, gathering resources, teaching children, and maintaining cultural practices. Worse still, migration paths often pushed Neanderthal groups into unfamiliar regions where competition for resources intensified, not only with animals, but increasingly with Homo sapiens. Climate instability and human competition were not separate forces. They collided. As Neanderthals struggled with shrinking habitats, sapiens expanded into the same spaces. Where Neanderthals saw diminishing resources, sapiens saw opportunities to test new tools, new hunting methods, and new social strategies. In many regions, sapiens followed the same animals that Neanderthals depended on. The landscape that had once comfortably supported small groups of Neanderthals now had to sustain two human species with very different survival strategies. Climate also reshaped the emotional world of Neanderthals. Stress left its mark in physical remains, but it also likely affected decision-making, risk tolerance, and group cohesion. When times are stable, humans invest in relationships, rituals, and learning. When survival becomes uncertain, priorities shift toward immediate needs. The archaeological record reflects this change. Symbolic artifacts, once present in earlier periods, become rarer. Ornaments, pigments, and carved objects decline in number. These absences don't imply a loss of intelligence. They reveal a society under immense pressure, forced to devote nearly every moment to staying alive. Another invisible force compounded these environmental stresses: disease. Small, isolated populations with low genetic diversity are more vulnerable to outbreaks, parasites, and nutritional deficiencies. Climate change can alter pathogen environments and increase exposure to new threats. While direct evidence of specific diseases in Neanderthals is difficult to trace, genetic studies show that their populations were already small and inbred by the end. An unstable climate likely worsened these vulnerabilities, making their bodies less resilient to infections that sapiens, with larger gene pools, could withstand more easily. Yet even under such strain, Neanderthals demonstrated remarkable perseverance. Some groups retreated to ecological refuges, areas that remained stable despite regional climate chaos. Coastal regions of Iberia, parts of the Caucasus, and pockets of southern Europe offered milder conditions, richer resources, and better shelter. These refuges prolonged Neanderthal survival by thousands of years. In some cases, they lived side by side with Homo sapiens without immediate conflict. Their persistence in these pockets challenges the outdated myth that Neanderthals were simply unable to adapt. But refuges can only support small populations, and small populations are always vulnerable. A single decade of extreme cold or a drop in prey availability could wipe out an entire group. Over time, these isolated communities dwindled, unable to exchange genes or cultural knowledge with one another, each living on borrowed time. The climate didn't need to exterminate Neanderthals directly. It only needed to limit their chances of recovery. Meanwhile, sapiens not only survived the same climatic challenges, they expanded through them. Their cultural networks allowed them to share innovations across vast distances. Their diets were flexible, their tools adaptable, their social bonds larger and more cooperative. Climate stress that weakened Neanderthals often strengthened sapiens by forcing them to innovate, communicate, and explore. In this way, climate change set the stage for a tipping point. Neanderthals were specialists in a world that rewarded generalists. Their physical strengths became less important than adaptability. Their deep-rooted traditions, once their greatest advantage, became harder to maintain in an environment that refused to stay the same. By the time the climate delivered its final series of shocks, Neanderthal populations were already fragmented, stressed, and genetically vulnerable. The stage was set for the next major force that would shape their fate: direct and indirect competition with Homo sapiens, a species whose arrival transformed every ecological and social pressure they faced. When Homo sapiens first entered Europe around 45,000 years ago, they stepped into a landscape already reshaped by climate instability. But for Neanderthals, this new arrival represented something far more significant than a change in the weather. It was the beginning of a profound shift in the balance of human power. Two species, so similar that they could understand one another, mate with one another, and even share tools, now found themselves competing for the same resources in some of the harshest environments on Earth. What happened next was not a sudden clash of enemies, but a long, subtle struggle, one shaped by differences in population size, culture, technology, and strategy. At first glance, Neanderthals appeared physically superior. They were stronger, more muscular, and built to withstand cold climates that would challenge even the toughest Homo sapiens. Their bones show evidence of immense strength: thick limbs, dense joints, and powerful shoulders capable of delivering devastating close-range strikes with wooden spears. For hundreds of thousands of years, this strength allowed them to dominate their territories. But strength alone does not determine survival. In environments where prey became unpredictable and distances between resources grew larger, endurance and adaptability mattered more than raw power. Here, sapiens held a critical advantage. Their bodies were slender and optimized for long-distance travel. Narrow hips and long legs allowed them to move across open plains with far less energy. Their lungs and heat regulation systems were more efficient for endurance running, a trait that helped them track prey over long distances rather than relying solely on ambushes. When prey migrated rapidly across vast territories due to climate change, sapiens could follow them. Neanderthals often could not. But physical differences were only the beginning. The sapiens who arrived in Europe carried cultural and cognitive advantages that would eventually reshape the continent. They created more sophisticated tools, including long-range projectile weapons that could strike prey from a distance. This drastically reduced the danger of hunting large animals. While Neanderthals still depended on close-range spears that required them to face their prey head-on, sapiens could hunt safely and efficiently, conserving energy and reducing injury. Their tools also showed greater diversity. Instead of relying on a single type of stone tool perfected over generations, sapiens constantly innovated and adapted their toolkit to new tasks. Bone needles, blades, scrapers, fishing equipment, and ornamentation all appear in their archaeological records shortly after their arrival. These innovations didn't just make survival easier, they strengthened social cohesion, identity, and communication. Every new tool carried knowledge, and sapiens were exceptional at spreading knowledge across groups. Neanderthals, by contrast, lived in small, isolated communities. Their populations were fragmented, often separated by hundreds of miles. Innovation was possible, but new ideas spread slowly, if at all. A breakthrough in one group might die with them if their population declined. Sapiens, meanwhile, maintained networks that stretched across continents. They exchanged information, materials, and cultural practices, giving them a dynamic, adaptable foundation for survival. Competition did not happen through direct conflict, at least not at first. Instead, it unfolded gradually as sapiens expanded into territories long held by Neanderthals. Archaeological evidence shows overlapping regions where the two species lived within sight of each other. Sometimes they coexisted peacefully for centuries. But as prey dwindled and climate pressure increased, competition for hunting grounds intensified. When two groups of humans chase the same herd of bison or seek shelter in the same caves, even small advantages can determine who survives and who does not. And sapiens held several such advantages. Their larger social groups allowed them to hunt cooperatively with greater precision. Their language skills helped them coordinate strategies and share knowledge more effectively. Their broader diets gave them flexibility to exploit new resources when traditional prey was scarce. Neanderthals, whose strategies were shaped by specialization, found themselves increasingly competing on unequal ground. There was also evidence that sapiens spread faster across Europe than Neanderthals could maintain. As sapiens' populations grew, they filled territories, forcing Neanderthals into smaller, less optimal regions, mountainous areas, forests with fewer prey, or colder northern lands. This shrinking ecological space pushed Neanderthals into survival bottlenecks where even minor disruptions could collapse entire communities. Yet one of the most important differences between the two species was not physical or technological, but demographic. Sapiens had larger, healthier populations. They reproduced at higher rates and maintained genetic diversity by connecting across broader distances. Neanderthal populations were small, isolated, and already weakened by centuries of climate strain. In a competition that stretched thousands of years, sheer numbers became one of the most powerful forces determining the outcome. And still, this was not a war. Neanderthals did not vanish overnight. In fact, they remained resilient and resourceful even during their final centuries. They continued to make sophisticated tools, survive harsh winters, and adapt as best they could. But survival is not just about effort. It is about the alignment of environment, strategy, and population strength. And in this long struggle, the scales tilted further and further in favor of Homo sapiens. But even as competition intensified, something unexpected happened between the two species, something that complicates the story of replacement and extinction. They met not only as rivals, but as kin. As the presence of Homo sapiens expanded across Europe, the competition between the two human species intensified, not always through direct conflict, but through the quiet, relentless pressures of survival. Neanderthals were not wiped out by a single battle or event. Instead, they were gradually pushed into ecological corners where survival became increasingly fragile. To understand this dynamic, we must examine how sapiens' cultural systems magnified every advantage they held. One of the defining differences between the two species was the scale of their social structures. Neanderthals typically lived in small, family-based groups, perhaps 10 to 25 individuals at a time. These groups were close-knit and deeply cooperative, but their size limited their ability to absorb shocks. If a few hunters were injured, or if a harsh winter reduced food supply, the group might never recover. In contrast, sapiens often formed interconnected networks of clans, sometimes totaling hundreds of individuals. These broader alliances allowed them to share resources, exchange mates, trade materials, and support one another during times of scarcity. Social cooperation, on this scale, created resilience that Neanderthals simply could not match. Language likely played a crucial role. While Neanderthals could certainly communicate, evidence suggests that sapiens possessed far more complex and flexible language systems. With richer vocabulary, they could share detailed strategies, pass knowledge quickly, and coordinate large group hunts. Language acted as a multiplier for every innovation. A new tool or hunting method could spread not just within one group, but across an entire region. This accelerated cultural evolution, something Neanderthals with fewer social connections could not replicate at the same pace. Territorial expansion deepened the divide. As sapiens followed herds across Europe, their populations grew rapidly. They settled in caves long used by Neanderthals, occupied river valleys, and built temporary camps in areas once dominated by the native species. But this wasn't a violent takeover. It was simple demographic pressure. When one population grows faster than another, it gradually fills the landscape. Neanderthals found themselves pushed into colder climates, higher elevations, or resource-poor environments where survival required even greater effort. These shifts left marks in the archaeological record. In regions where sapiens arrived, Neanderthals' presence decreases within just a few centuries. Tool types change. Settlement patterns become thinner. Hearths, once filled with signs of daily life, appear less frequently. The world was not turning against Neanderthals by choice. The environment and competition together created conditions they could not match. Another subtle but powerful factor was innovation speed. Sapiens consistently introduced new technologies throughout their expansion: improved blade tools, bone harpoons, decorated objects, and long-range projectiles. Each advancement gave them more efficient ways to secure food, create shelter, or strengthen social bonds. Neanderthals also innovated, but their rate of cultural change was slower. When a sapiens group mastered a new technique, dozens of other groups could adopt it within a few seasons. For Neanderthals, those changes could take centuries. Speed mattered. In a world of rapid climate change and intensifying competition, the species that adapted fastest held a decisive edge. But despite these advantages, sapiens did not immediately replace Neanderthals. For thousands of years, the two species overlapped. They likely traded objects, shared knowledge, and learned from one another. In some regions, Neanderthals appear to have adopted sapien-style tools. This exchange complicates the idea of a purely competitive relationship. It suggests a deeper truth. Neanderthals were aware of the changes around them and attempted to adapt to the newcomers' innovations. Yet adaptation could only go so far. The pressures they faced were not isolated. They were cumulative. Climate shifts weakened their populations. Scarcity strained their social systems. Competition for prey made hunting riskier. Every challenge magnified the others. And through it all, sapiens continued to grow in number and expand into previously Neanderthal-held territories. There is another aspect many researchers consider: the possibility of indirect competition through disease. When two human species meet after long periods of separation, pathogens can spread rapidly. Sapiens traveling from Africa and the Near East may have carried diseases that Neanderthal immune systems were unprepared for. Even a mild illness in sapiens could be deadly to small, isolated Neanderthal groups. While direct evidence is limited, the demographic patterns mirror what happens when modern, isolated populations encounter new pathogens. But competition wasn't only physical or biological, it was cognitive. Sapiens created art, rituals, and symbolic systems that strengthened identity and cooperation. Cave paintings, beads, engraved bones, and musical instruments all appear shortly after their arrival. These were not decorations. They were tools of cohesion that formed large, connected societies with shared stories and values. Neanderthals, though capable of symbolic behavior, did not develop such widespread cultural networks. In the long run, culture became a survival weapon, one that sapiens wielded with extraordinary efficiency. By the time sapiens dominated most of Europe, Neanderthals were reduced to fragmented pockets, small, isolated groups struggling to maintain their numbers. Competition had taken its toll, but not in the way early scientists imagined. It wasn't brute force or superiority in a single trait. It was 1,000 small advantages: flexibility, innovation, communication, population size, stacking together until the scales tipped irreversibly. Yet even in these final chapters of competition, something other than rivalry was happening between the two species, something that would shape the DNA of billions alive today. Amid the pressure of a changing climate and the rising presence of Homo sapiens, an unexpected phenomenon unfolded between the two human species that once shared the same continent. Instead of constant conflict or avoidance, their encounters became moments of curiosity, cooperation, and, eventually, something even deeper. Modern genetics has revealed that these meetings were not only social exchanges around a fire or along a hunting trail, they resulted in children. And those children carried a blend of genes that continues to exist in billions of people today. The discovery came in the early 21st century when researchers sequenced the human genome and uncovered a surprising truth. People living outside Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This small percentage changed everything scientists once assumed. It proved that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did not remain isolated. They formed relationships, lived together at times, and had offspring that survived and reproduced. These were not rare accidents. They occurred repeatedly in several regions, including the Middle East, Central Europe, and possibly the Caucasus. These encounters were possible because the two species were remarkably similar. Both used fire, created tools, hunted large animals, and understood the same landscape. They recognized each other as human. When two groups met, they shared more similarities than differences. It is likely that communication was possible at a basic level. They may have traded materials or copied each other's techniques. In this contact zone, mixed families emerged, and Neanderthal genes began to flow into sapiens populations. Yet the genetic exchange happened at a time when Neanderthal numbers were already extremely small. Even when they had children with sapiens, those children usually became part of larger Homo sapiens groups. Over generations, Neanderthal DNA blended into the expanding sapiens population. Entire Neanderthal groups were disappearing, but their genetic legacy was being absorbed. It was not a sudden replacement, but a slow merging, a quiet transfer of ancestry from one species into another. Some of the genes passed down turned out to be beneficial. Several Neanderthal variants improved immune responses against ancient Eurasian viruses. Others helped early humans adapt to colder climates. These advantages allowed sapiens entering Europe and Asia to survive diseases and environmental stresses they had never encountered before. In this sense, Neanderthal genes contributed directly to the success of the species that would eventually dominate the world. But not every inherited gene was a blessing. Some variants linked to Neanderthal ancestry increased the risk of autoimmune disorders, diabetes, and other modern illnesses. Traits that were once adaptive in a harsh Ice Age environment, such as stronger inflammatory responses, can become harmful in modern conditions. These lingering disadvantages show that genetic mixing was not a simple partnership. It was a complex biological exchange with long-lasting consequences. Behind the genetic data lies a demographic reality. Neanderthals lived in small, isolated groups. Their limited population size reduced genetic diversity and increased the impact of inbreeding. Studies show that many Neanderthal individuals carried long stretches of DNA typical of small populations under stress. This genetic fragility made them more vulnerable to disease, lowered fertility rates, and reduced their ability to recover from population losses. When they mixed with sapiens, many of their weaker variants were eliminated naturally, while useful genes persisted. It was evolution playing out in real time. Ironically, the period of greatest mixing between the two species coincided with the period when Neanderthals were most vulnerable. As their territory shrank and their numbers fell, their final interactions with Homo sapiens became the last gateway through which their lineage could continue. They did not continue as a separate species, but as part of us. Their bodies vanished from the world, but their DNA survived in the billions who carry a small but permanent imprint of their ancient existence. Through this genetic window, we see a truth far more nuanced than extinction alone. Neanderthals did not disappear in the way mammoths or saber-toothed cats did. They faded into us. And in doing so, they shaped the immune systems, biology, and evolutionary path of modern humans. The blending of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was not a brief encounter, but a gradual, repeated process that unfolded across thousands of years. Each time the two species met, new layers of genetic exchange were added to the human story. These were not isolated moments. They were part of a long period in which the fading population of Neanderthals intersected with the rising populations of sapiens, creating pockets of shared ancestry across Europe and Western Asia. Through this lens, extinction becomes more complex. It becomes less a disappearance and more a transformation. Genetic evidence reveals that different waves of mixing occurred in different regions. The earliest mixing may have happened before sapiens even entered Europe, during migrations through the Middle East. Later encounters happened deeper in Europe as sapiens expanded into territories that Neanderthals had held for millennia. These later interactions produced hybrid children who carried traits from both species. Some children lived in Neanderthal groups, others lived entirely among sapiens. Over time, nearly all of them became absorbed into Homo sapiens communities because those communities were larger, healthier, and expanding. This demographic imbalance shaped the genetic legacy we see today. Neanderthals made up a small fraction of the human population even before their decline. When two populations mix, the genes of the larger group dominate the long-term outcome. Neanderthals did not have the numbers needed to maintain a separate identity once their children began integrating into sapient societies. Their genetic signature became diluted, but not lost, as it spread across Eurasia through generations of sapiens' offspring. While the surviving Neanderthal genes in modern humans make up only a few percent, what they represent is significant. These genes influence skin traits, hair thickness, immune responses, and even the way bodies react to altitude or temperature. Some affect metabolism. Others shape how the immune system detects viruses. A handful are linked to behavioral tendencies, although these findings remain debated. What is clear is that Neanderthal DNA is not a fossil trapped in time. It remains active inside living humans, shaping biology in subtle ways. The delicacy of Neanderthal populations also contributed to the uneven flow of genes. Their groups were small enough that a single epidemic, a harsh winter, or the loss of a few reproductive adults could devastate an entire community. By contrast, sapiens groups were interconnected. When one group weakened, another could support it. This difference created a situation in which hybrid offspring usually entered the larger, more stable sapiens population instead of strengthening the declining Neanderthal one. The genetic bridge became one way. For Neanderthals, small population size brought another problem. Inbreeding increased the likelihood of harmful genetic variants, which could weaken overall health, reduce fertility, and make recovery from population shocks nearly impossible. Fossil DNA shows long stretches of identical genetic sequences, a sign that Neanderthals often lived in small and isolated communities. These genetic constraints tightened further as their numbers fell. As sapiens spread, these constraints deepened. Isolated Neanderthal groups were cut off from each other. Cultural knowledge was lost. Mating partners became scarce. In some places, Neanderthals and sapiens lived side by side, yet only one species gained ground. Each generation brought a little more mixing and a little less separation, until the boundary between the two species began to blur. In this long and quiet process, the meaning of extinction shifts. It becomes less an event and more a slow merging of one lineage into another. Neanderthals did not simply vanish from the earth. Their identities dissolved into a growing wave of Homo sapiens who continued expanding across continents. What remained was not their bodies or their tools, but their genetic echoes, carried into the future through the children of mixed ancestry. The idea that Neanderthals live on inside modern humans changes the emotional weight of their story. They were not failures of evolution. They were contributors to it. They shaped the immune defenses of billions. They influenced traits that helped ancient humans survive new climates. Their DNA has traveled farther than any of their own migrations ever did, reaching every modern city, every culture, and every generation alive today. But even though a part of them survived, the Neanderthal world itself continued to shrink. Their last communities retreated to isolated refuges. Their tools appeared less frequently. Their presence in the archaeological record grew quieter. The genetic legacy remained, but the species that carried it continued to decline. Soon, the forces shaping their fate would converge into a final collapse that no migration, no innovation, no mixing could reverse. As the final millennia of Neanderthal history unfolded, the forces shaping their decline no longer acted separately. Climate instability, competition with Homo sapiens, and genetic vulnerability were no longer individual challenges. They began to merge into a single, overwhelming pressure that pushed Neanderthals into the narrowest corners of survival. Their world was not ending because of one decisive event. It was ending because every factor worked together, tightening around them generation after generation. Archaeological layers from their final strongholds tell a story of shrinking possibilities. Caves that once held evidence of long-term occupation now show signs of brief, hurried visits. Hearths appear less frequently. The diversity of tools declines. It is not that Neanderthals forgot how to thrive. It is that the conditions needed for them to thrive no longer existed. The animals they hunted were changing. The landscapes they understood were shifting, and the human world around them was filling with a new species that adapted faster, moved farther, and reproduced more quickly. There were still pockets where Neanderthals held on, places where mountains or coastlines or sheltered valleys offered more stable conditions. Southern Iberia, parts of the Balkans, and isolated regions near the Mediterranean provided temporary refuge. In these areas, Neanderthals continued to live, hunt, and raise children long after they disappeared from other parts of Europe. Their resilience in these refuges shows that they remained strong and capable. But refuges are by nature limited. They can support only small populations, and small populations are always vulnerable to even minor disruptions. In these shrinking territories, the structure of Neanderthal life changed. Groups grew smaller. Movements became restricted. Overlapping ranges among communities decreased. As a result, genetic diversity continued to fall. When individuals from different regions no longer met, the opportunity for new combinations of genes vanished. Inbreeding increased. Harmful genetic variants spread more easily. Each generation inherited slightly more fragility than the one before. This genetic strain did not act alone. It interacted with every other pressure. When food became scarce, weakened immune systems had a harder time recovering. When winters grew harsher, vulnerable individuals had fewer chances of surviving. When sapiens competed for the same prey, Neanderthal groups had a smaller margin for error. Genetic weakness magnified environmental challenges, and environmental challenges magnified genetic weakness. Together, they formed a downward spiral. Meanwhile, sapiens continued to expand with momentum. Their populations grew rapidly. Their networks spanned wide territories. Their innovations spread quickly. Wherever they entered, they brought new tools, new hunting methods, and new strategies that further increased their resilience. In this landscape, Neanderthals were not simply outnumbered. They were outpaced in cultural evolution and ecological flexibility. Still, the idea that sapiens directly destroyed Neanderthals does not fit the evidence. There are no widespread signs of violence, no mass graves, no clear battlefield. The disappearance was far more subtle. It was the gradual erosion of Neanderthal advantages and the steady rise of sapiens advantages. Every winter, every scarce hunting season, every failed birth tilted the balance a little further. By the time the last Neanderthal groups remained, the world around them had transformed into a place where the strategies that once ensured their survival no longer worked. Those final communities must have lived with increasing isolation. Children grew up with fewer playmates. Clans had fewer hunters. Elders carried knowledge that no longer matched the environment. Even their cultural traditions, once passed through countless generations, may have weakened as survival consumed every moment. When groups are reduced to only a few families, the collapse of social structure becomes almost inevitable. And yet, even in their final centuries, Neanderthals endured with the same qualities that had carried them through earlier Ice Age storms. They hunted with skill. They built fires in cold caves. They protected their young. They survived through intense seasons of hardship. Their disappearance was not the result of a lack of intelligence or strength. It was the result of a world that changed too quickly, too relentlessly, and in ways that favored a different kind of human. Their final days did not sound like defeat. They sounded like persistence. They lived until they could no longer sustain the fragile balance required for their small populations to continue. And when their bodies finally vanished from the continent, their genetic footprints remained, carried by the very species that had shared their world and shaped their fate. But the story is not finished. Even as Neanderthal communities dwindled, their legacy was already embedded inside Homo sapiens. The end of their physical presence was not the end of their influence. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written not by their own hands, but through the DNA they left behind. As the last Neanderthal groups struggled through their final centuries, the pressures shaping their fate reached a point where recovery was no longer possible. Each factor reinforced the others. Their populations were too small, their territories too fragmented, their genetic diversity too diminished. And the world around them had been reshaped by a species whose strengths amplified every Neanderthal weakness. The landscape of Europe had quietly shifted into a place where the strategies that once defined Neanderthal success could no longer sustain them. Archaeological records from these final phases offer glimpses into lives lived on the edge of survival. In some regions, the number of tools drops dramatically. Stone flakes become smaller, suggesting a scarcity of raw materials or an urgency that left less time for preparation. Hearths appear infrequently, which may reflect shorter stays in caves or a reduced ability to maintain fire. Even the bones of hunted animals show patterns of increasing desperation. Many come from young or malnourished prey, signs that large game was becoming hard to find. These clues do not reveal a collapse of intelligence or skill. They reveal a collapse of opportunity. A species designed for stability had been thrown into constant flux. Their deep knowledge of seasonal rhythms and animal migrations could no longer be relied upon because the rhythms themselves were breaking. The climate was shifting faster than their learned traditions could adapt. And in a world where food was unpredictable, group size mattered more than ever. When a single harsh winter arrived, sapiens populations could spread the burden across many families. Neanderthals could not. Even so, extinction was not immediate. Some groups in southern Europe continued to survive for thousands of years after their cousins in the north had vanished. These survivors may have lived in milder coastal regions where resources were more consistent. They hunted red deer, gathered shellfish, and used limestone caves as shelter. Their resilience shows that they were still capable hunters and resourceful humans. But these pockets were isolated. None had enough individuals to form a stable, growing population. A single influenza-like illness, a landslide, a drought, or a failed hunting season could erase an entire clan. As sapiens expanded, even these refuges became temporary. The newcomers were not predators in the traditional sense. They did not hunt Neanderthals. They did not drive them systematically from their homes. Instead, sapiens moved steadily into regions where prey was abundant and resources were accessible. Every new valley they occupied limited the space left for Neanderthal groups. Every successful sapiens birth reduced the relative population share of Neanderthals. Generation by generation, sapiens filled the continent through simple demographic momentum. The demographic shift was so powerful that even if Neanderthals had matched sapiens in intelligence, strength, or creativity, their smaller numbers alone might have sealed their fate. Once a population drops below a certain threshold, recovery becomes almost impossible. There are not enough mating partners, not enough children born each generation, and not enough genetic diversity to remain healthy. The final Neanderthal communities likely lived with the quiet awareness of dwindling numbers. Their children grew up in a world where distant groups they once traded with no longer existed. In this fragile environment, every loss mattered. The death of a skilled hunter could weaken an entire clan. The disappearance of one group could eliminate unique knowledge or genetic traits forever. And each time a Neanderthal child joined a sapiens community through mixed ancestry, one more thread of their lineage slipped into another species' pipeline. This merging ensured that their DNA survived, but also meant that their identity as a distinct species was fading from the world. Eventually, the archaeological record falls silent. The youngest Neanderthal fossils come from the southern tip of Europe, from caves overlooking the sea. After that, there are no more tools carved in the distinctive Neanderthal style. No more hearths arranged in the familiar patterns. No more bones of robust bodies built for the Ice Age. Their world ended quietly, without a single moment that marks their final day. They simply reach a point where the evidence stops. Yet their disappearance does not feel like an ending. It feels like a transition. Their DNA continued inside the expanding sapiens population. Their immune adaptations helped early humans survive new diseases. Their genes shaped the physical traits of people across Eurasia. Their story did not conclude when the last clan vanished. It continued in the bloodlines of the species that outlasted them. As we follow the arc of their final centuries, a larger truth becomes clear. No single factor explains their extinction. It was the combined weight of climate, competition, isolation, and genetic strain. It was a world that changed too quickly and too profoundly. And in that turbulent world, a species built on specialization was gradually overshadowed by a species built on flexibility. The Neanderthals did not lose because they were weak. They lost because the rules of survival changed. The disappearance of Neanderthals was not the result of a single cause. It was the outcome of multiple forces that intersected until they formed a perfect storm. But to understand why these forces were so devastating, we must look closely at how each one weakened the Neanderthals in ways that fed into the others. Their extinction was not a simple chain reaction. It was a complex web where every thread pulled on every other thread, tightening over time until no escape remained. Climate instability played one of the most powerful roles. The Neanderthals had survived previous Ice Age cycles, but the final swings were unusually abrupt. A few decades of warming or cooling could transform entire regions. Forests vanished, plains opened, herds migrated, rivers froze. These changes forced Neanderthals to move more often, but every movement came with risks. Injuries became more common. Food security became fragile. Long distances pushed their endurance limits. Each difficult season left them slightly weaker, both physically and demographically. This environmental pressure collided directly with the arrival of Homo sapiens. The newcomers adapted quickly to unstable landscapes. They hunted both large and small animals. They shifted techniques when conditions changed. They formed wider social networks that exchanged information across vast distances. In an unpredictable climate, adaptability became the primary advantage. Neanderthals, however, relied on stable patterns learned across hundreds of generations. When those patterns broke, their cultural systems could not adjust at the same speed. Population size was another silent but devastating factor. Even before contact with sapiens, Neanderthal groups were small. They lived in scattered pockets, often separated by mountains or long distances. This isolation reduced gene flow and increased the risk of inbreeding. When climate pressures intensified and sapiens began to occupy key hunting grounds, Neanderthal groups lost the ability to reconnect. Every separated pocket became a fragile island. Genetic studies reveal long stretches of identical DNA in late Neanderthal individuals, evidence that they descended from small, isolated populations for many generations. Low genetic diversity made it harder for them to resist disease, adapt to new pathogens, or maintain healthy birth rates. A species does not need to collapse entirely for extinction to become inevitable. It only needs to lose the capacity to replace itself. Neanderthals were approaching that threshold long before their final disappearance. Competition with sapiens worsened these vulnerabilities. Although there is little evidence of direct violence, sapiens outcompeted Neanderthals simply by being more numerous and more adaptable. In regions where both species lived, Neanderthal tools became less common over time. Sapien settlements expanded. Their hunting methods pressured animal populations. Their presence forced Neanderthals into marginal territories where survival was already difficult. Even without conflict, the larger population will eventually dominate the landscape. Technology also played a subtle role. Sapiens used long-range weapons like throwing spears and early projectile systems, which allowed them to hunt dangerous animals with lower risk. Neanderthals relied heavily on close-range thrusting spears. This difference meant that sapiens could secure food at a lower cost. They suffered fewer injuries. They used less energy. Over time, these small advantages accumulated. Even a slightly higher survival rate for hunters translated into more children, more support for elders, and more stable communities. Social structure added another layer. Sapiens lived in larger networks that shared food, tools, and knowledge across wide regions. A new idea discovered by one group could reach others within a few seasons. A successful hunting technique could spread far beyond the original community. For Neanderthals, cultural transmission was limited to smaller groups. Innovations, when they appeared, spread slowly and inconsistently. In a world changing at high speed, slow cultural adaptation became a major disadvantage. Disease may have contributed as well. Sapiens carried pathogens from Africa and the Near East. Some of these viruses and bacteria were new to Neanderthals. Even mild illnesses could devastate small, isolated populations. A single outbreak could wipe out an entire clan. Although direct evidence is limited, genetic patterns suggest that Neanderthals lacked immune diversity compared to sapiens, making them more vulnerable to novel diseases. All of these pressures combined to create a long period of decline. There were no dramatic collapses or sudden disappearances. There were fewer children, fewer successful hunts, fewer healthy adults, and fewer stable communities. The decline was gradual but steady, until only the final pockets of Neanderthals remained, living in refuges where they held on for centuries. They did not fail suddenly. they slowly lost the conditions needed to thrive. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, their influence on the human story was already guaranteed. Their genes lived on inside the species that was replacing them. Their tools, shelters, and survival knowledge shaped early sapiens practices in Europe. Their presence altered the landscape long before their disappearance. The forces that extinguished Neanderthals did not erase them completely. They reshaped them into something new. The decline of Neanderthals did not happen in a dramatic collapse. It unfolded slowly, almost silently, as multiple pressures continued to tighten around them. Each factor on its own might not have been fatal. Climate instability might have been survivable. Competition with sapiens might have been manageable. Genetic strain might have been a challenge, but not a death sentence. But when all of these forces came together at the same time, the result was a long, irreversible contraction of their population. Their numbers fell not because they lacked intelligence or strength, but because the world had shifted in ways that undermined the foundation of their survival. In regions where Neanderthals once thrived, archaeologists have found evidence of how their lifeways became more fragile. Many sites show signs that hunting returned smaller yields. The bones of prey grew thinner and younger, suggesting that herds were under pressure from both climate change and the hunting activities of sapiens. Neanderthals were forced to take more risks for less reward. Injuries became more common. The energy cost of survival increased, and with fewer individuals in each group, every injury mattered. The seasonal patterns that had guided Neanderthal culture for thousands of years were no longer reliable. The animals they tracked did not migrate along the same predictable routes. Weather patterns became erratic. Winters lengthened or shortened without warning. Summers brought periods of drought. These changes fractured the cultural knowledge passed from elder to youth. The accumulated wisdom of hundreds of generations became harder to apply in a world that refused to behave as expected. At the same time, sapiens were thriving precisely because they were built for unpredictability. Their ability to innovate rapidly allowed them to create new solutions to changing conditions. They used different materials for tools. They built more flexible shelters. They formed alliances with distant groups. These strategies gave sapiens the ability to absorb climate shocks without collapsing. Neanderthals, tied to smaller social units and more specialized hunting methods, struggled to respond with the same flexibility. The population imbalance grew even more pronounced as time passed. When sapiens experienced a temporary setback, neighboring groups could help. When Neanderthals experienced a setback, it often meant the end of an entire community. Over time, the number of functioning Neanderthal groups shrank. Fewer groups meant fewer mating opportunities. Fewer mating opportunities meant even lower genetic diversity. And lower genetic diversity meant greater vulnerability to disease, fertility issues, and environmental stress. This diminishing genetic pool created a quiet but powerful force pushing Neanderthals toward extinction. It acted behind the scenes, weakening their resilience even as they continued to survive for thousands of years. Genetic fragility does not kill instantly. It reduces the number of surviving offspring. It increases the impact of mild illnesses. It amplifies the consequences of hunger and cold. It makes each winter harder to endure and each injury more dangerous. By their final centuries, Neanderthals were caught in this downward cycle. Meanwhile, the presence of Homo sapiens increased across the continent. Their populations grew, their cultures flourished, their networks expanded. Even in areas where direct competition was minimal, the sheer number of sapiens created pressure on the shared ecosystem. More hunters meant fewer animals. More camps meant fewer territories where Neanderthals could settle without conflict. The landscape that once supported both species was no longer large enough for both to thrive. Some regions show signs that Neanderthals briefly adopted or imitated sapiens' tools. This suggests that they were aware of the changes around them and tried to adapt. But cultural borrowing cannot compensate for structural disadvantages in population size and genetic health. Innovation helps only when there are enough people to spread and refine those innovations. The dwindling Neanderthal group simply did not have that capacity. In their final phase, Neanderthals occupied small refuges where environmental conditions remained relatively stable. These areas gave them a temporary advantage, allowing them to outlast their northern relatives by thousands of years. But refuges are a temporary answer. They restrict movement. They restrict population growth. They restrict the ability to find new mates. Once trapped in a refuge, a species may persist but cannot expand. It survives but does not recover. Eventually, even these pockets reached a point where one harsh season, one disease outbreak, or one failed generation could push them beyond the threshold of survival. And when that threshold was crossed, the last remaining lineages disappeared. But this disappearance was not absolute. The genetic exchange with sapiens ensured that a trace of Neanderthals continued into the future. Their adaptations, strengths, and vulnerabilities were carried forward in the DNA of a rising species. They were no longer a separate branch of humanity, but a quiet part of the lineage that would populate every continent. Their extinction was emerging, a transformation from a distinct species into a genetic legacy woven into the story of modern humans. In that sense, the end of Neanderthals marked not only the close of one evolutionary chapter, but the beginning of another. The disappearance of Neanderthals can feel distant when viewed through fossils and stone tools, but their presence remains surprisingly close when examined through the genetic signatures they left behind. Modern DNA provides a direct connection to these ancient humans and reveals insights that were once impossible to uncover. It shows that Neanderthals did not simply vanish. They contributed threads to the blueprint of Homo sapiens, shaping traits, immune responses, and even aspects of human biology that continue to influence life today. One of the most striking discoveries of the past 2 decades is that people outside Africa carry a small but consistent percentage of Neanderthal DNA. This means that the last interactions between the two species did not only involve competition for food or shelter, they involved relationships. These relationships created biological bridges that allowed parts of the Neanderthal lineage to survive long after their physical presence faded from the archaeological record. What remains today are fragments of their genome scattered across billions of people. Some of these fragments offered immediate advantages to early Homo sapiens entering Eurasia. When sapiens migrated into colder regions filled with unfamiliar pathogens, they encountered viruses and bacteria that Neanderthals had lived with for hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthal immune genes provided ready-made defenses. Variants of these genes increased the ability of early humans to recognize and respond to Eurasian viruses. This transfer of immunity gave sapiens a head start in an environment where disease could determine the fate of entire communities. Other Neanderthal genes influenced the skin and hair of early Eurasians. Some variants helped regulate keratin, the protein responsible for hair and skin structure. In cold climates with low sunlight, these traits may have helped sapiens adapt to new environmental pressures. A few Neanderthal-derived genes also affect how the body responds to ultraviolet radiation. These inherited adaptations reveal that Neanderthals had already solved many of the challenges sapiens encountered as they pushed northward. Yet their genetic legacy is not limited to advantages. Some Neanderthal variants are linked to increased sensitivity to certain allergens or to stronger inflammatory responses. While these reactions were beneficial in prehistoric environments where wounds and infections were constant threats, they can contribute to autoimmune conditions in modern settings. A few Neanderthal genes influence metabolism in ways that may have been useful during fluctuating Ice Age food cycles, but can contribute to issues like type 2 diabetes in contemporary lifestyles. These dual outcomes show that evolution does not create perfect solutions. It creates adaptations for specific environments, and those adaptations may become risks when environments change. There is also evidence that Neanderthal DNA affects sleep cycles and circadian rhythms. Some variants influence how the body responds to seasonal changes in daylight, which may reflect Neanderthal adaptation to high-latitude regions where day length varies dramatically across the year. These traits, inherited by Homo sapiens, continue to influence how people respond to long winters and short summers. Even aspects of human behavior may carry faint echoes of Neanderthal ancestry. Research suggests that certain genetic variants related to brain development and neurological processes come from Neanderthals. Although their exact effects remain nuanced, these inherited elements highlight the deep biological connections between the two species. They are not evidence of drastic differences in cognition, but they show that Neanderthal contributions touch nearly every system in the human body. Despite these lasting influences, most Neanderthal DNA did not survive. Natural selection gradually removed many variants that were incompatible with the physiology of Homo sapiens or offered no benefit in changing environments. Only the most useful, neutral, or resilient fragments persisted. This selective survival created a genetic fingerprint that represents not the whole of Neanderthals, but the parts of them that fit into the broader human lineage. The picture that emerges from this genetic record challenges old narratives. It shows that Neanderthals were not an evolutionary dead end. They were part of the human family. Their genes traveled across continents, across millennia, and across billions of births. Their DNA became part of the foundation upon which modern human diversity was built. They influenced immunity, physiology, and aspects of adaptation that allowed Homo sapiens to spread across every corner of the planet. Through this lens, extinction becomes a misleading term. The Neanderthals who once hunted on frozen plains and sheltered in limestone caves did not entirely disappear. Their bodies may have vanished, but their biology survived, carried forward by descendants who no longer remember them consciously, but still carry silent traces of their existence. The story of Neanderthals does not end when their fossils fade from the record. It continues every time a child inherits a gene that once belonged to them. The more scientists study Neanderthal DNA, the clearer it becomes that their legacy is not only biological, but also a silent narrative woven into human evolution. Their genes provide clues about how they lived, what challenges they faced, and how their bodies functioned in a world defined by cold climates and unpredictable environments. These genetic remnants are not random. They form a mosaic that reflects the strengths, vulnerabilities, and adaptations of a species that survived for far longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far. One of the most compelling insights comes from genes involved in immune response. Neanderthals evolved in Eurasia for more than 300,000 years. During that time, they encountered diseases unique to those regions. Their immune systems adapted accordingly. When Homo sapiens arrived from Africa, they encountered foreign pathogens that their immune systems had never faced. The transfer of Neanderthal immune genes through interbreeding offered early sapiens a significant advantage, giving them a pre-tested toolkit for surviving Eurasian diseases. Even now, some Neanderthal variants influence how the human body fights viruses and how strongly it responds to infections. Another domain where Neanderthal DNA continues to play a role is skin and hair physiology. Some inherited variants affect the thickness of hair and the robustness of keratin, offering protection against cold winds and harsh climates. Others influence pigmentation, regulating how skin reacts to ultraviolet light. These traits were shaped by life in Ice Age Europe and can still be found in modern populations across Eurasia. They reveal how deeply Neanderthal adaptation was tied to environmental conditions and how those adaptations became part of the global human gene pool. Neanderthal DNA also intersects with metabolism. Some genes influence fat storage, insulin sensitivity, and how the body manages energy during periods of scarcity. These traits made sense in environments where food availability shifted with the seasons and starvation was a real threat. But in modern societies with stable food supplies, these inherited metabolic patterns can contribute to weight gain or metabolic disorders. This contrast highlights a fundamental truth of evolution. What is adaptive in one environment may become a vulnerability in another. There are also subtler influences. Certain Neanderthal variants affect circadian rhythms, influencing how people sleep, wake, and respond to changes in daylight. These adjustments were useful for populations living at high latitudes, where winters are dark and summers bring long hours of sunlight. The fact that such genes persist today shows how deeply Neanderthals were tuned to northern climates. Homo sapiens carried those adaptations with them as they spread across the globe. Perhaps most intriguing are genetic links to neurological development. While these effects are complex and not fully understood, some Neanderthal-derived variants influence brain organization, synaptic communication, or mood regulation. These findings do not suggest that Neanderthals thought radically differently from sapiens, but they highlight that they had their own evolutionary path, their own pressures, and their own adaptations. Those differences, in small measures, became part of us. Yet the presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans is only part of the story. The absence of certain genes is equally revealing. Some Neanderthal DNA appears to have been actively removed by natural selection over thousands of years. This purging suggests incompatibilities in fertility, development, or overall fitness when certain Neanderthal variants were combined with sapiens' physiology. Such selective removal underscores that interbreeding between the two species was biologically possible, but not always advantageous. The genomic record is a negotiation between what worked, what failed, and what endured. This selective pattern also tells us something deeper about their extinction. Neanderthals did not simply merge genetically with sapiens. Only fragments of their genome proved beneficial enough to persist. The rest faded with the decline of their small populations. Their extinction therefore becomes a dual reality. They vanished as a physical species, yet survived partially as a genetic inheritance. The two outcomes are inseparable. The story written in DNA highlights a poignant truth. Neanderthals did not disappear because they were weak or unintelligent. They disappeared because they were fragile in population size and vulnerable to environmental change. And yet they were strong enough, resilient enough, and close enough to sapiens to leave a permanent mark on every generation that followed. Their DNA has traveled across continents and oceans, far beyond any region they ever walked. Today, that legacy connects billions of people to a species that shaped the human story long before recorded history. It reminds us that human evolution is not a simple ladder, but a branching, intertwining tree. Neanderthals were not a failed branch. They were a vital part of the network that eventually produced modern humanity. Their genetic echoes remain a quiet testament to their long presence on Earth, an inheritance carried forward even by those who do not know they bear it. As the genetic legacy of Neanderthals reveals their deep connection to modern humans, the archaeological record provides another lens into their disappearance. Fossils, tools, and settlement patterns show how their world narrowed until only scattered pockets remained. These final refuges were not signs of weakness, but proof of remarkable endurance. Neanderthals held on through changing climates, shifting ecosystems, and expanding sapiens populations for far longer than many species could have. Their resilience carries through every remaining site that marks the closing chapters of their existence. One of the most striking ways to trace this decline is through the reduction of Neanderthal range. Earlier in their history, they spread across Europe, parts of the Middle East, and Central Asia. Their presence extended from the Atlantic coast to the Altai Mountains. But as environmental and competitive pressures increased, these territories shrank. Regions that once held thriving Neanderthal communities showed decreasing evidence of habitation. Caves that once served as seasonal homes now contain only faint traces of short visits, or none at all. These patterns reflect a gradual disruption of traditional life. Neanderthal groups that had lived in the same territories for thousands of years were forced to move more often, abandon familiar hunting grounds, and seek new sources of food. Some regions reveal a dramatic shift from large game hunting to increased reliance on smaller prey. This was not a preference, but a necessity. Large mammals were becoming rarer under pressure from climate change and from the rise of sapiens groups who hunted with greater range and efficiency. The decline of large prey removed one of the pillars of Neanderthal survival. Another piece of evidence comes from the complexity of tools. Earlier Neanderthal toolkits were highly specialized and effective for their way of life. But in their final centuries, those toolkits began to falter. Some sites show simpler tools or reduced craftsmanship, possibly because groups were smaller and had fewer skilled toolmakers. Other sites, intriguingly, show tools resembling those made by Homo sapiens. This suggests cultural borrowing, an attempt by Neanderthals to adapt through imitation. The presence of these tools shows a species aware of change and trying to adjust, yet limited by demographic strain. Alongside these technological shifts, settlement patterns reveal shorter occupations. Neanderthals once stayed in certain caves for extended periods, leaving behind layers of ash, broken bones, and tool debris. In later times, layers become thinner. Occupations were brief, likely reflecting increased mobility and the constant search for resources. This lack of long-term stability indicates that Neanderthals no longer had reliable territories where large herds returned every season. Another sign of their dwindling numbers appears in social structure. As populations declined, the spread of ideas slowed. Cultural knowledge that once passed through many communities became fragmented. Groups became more isolated and less able to exchange techniques or innovations. The rhythm of cultural evolution, once steady, began to fade. This was not a collapse of intelligence, but the natural result of living in shrinking, scattered bands that lacked the population size needed for cultural resilience. Despite these pressures, the final Neanderthal refuges show remarkable perseverance. Southern regions like Gibraltar, pockets of Italy, parts of the Balkans and the Caucasus provided environments where cold winds softened, vegetation survived, and animals remained available. In these places, Neanderthals continued to hunt, build fires, and raise children. Their ability to persist in these refuges for thousands of years after their decline elsewhere is a testament to their adaptability and strength. Yet even these strongholds had limits. Refuges can support only a few dozen individuals at a time. Small populations can survive for long periods, but not indefinitely. With every birth that failed and every adult lost, the margin for survival narrowed. The combined pressures of climate unpredictability, reduced prey, limited gene flow, and competition with sapiens encroached even on the most sheltered areas. Eventually, the archaeological record grows quiet. There is no dramatic final site that marks their last stand. Their presence simply fades. One generation did not realize they were among the final Neanderthals. They lived their lives as their ancestors had, unaware that the lineage they carried was approaching its end. Their disappearance was not a moment of collapse, but the silent conclusion of a long struggle. These final refuges offer more than a record of decline. They show a species capable of extraordinary endurance, one that survived repeated environmental catastrophes and persisted in hostile landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years. They remind us that extinction is not always the result of weakness. Sometimes it is the result of being outnumbered, outpaced, and surrounded by forces no species can withstand forever. The quiet disappearance of Neanderthals from the archaeological record invites a deeper look into what their final centuries truly looked like. These were not empty years. They were filled with the daily struggles, small victories, and persistent determination of a species holding on in the face of mounting challenges. Their survival in isolated refuges speaks to a resilience that often goes unrecognized. Even as their world contracted, they continued to do what humans have always done. They adapted, worked together, and searched for opportunities to endure. Some of the most detailed insights into their final era come from caves that served as temporary shelters. These caves preserve traces of fire, cooking, tool-making, and butchering. But in the later layers, these traces become thinner and more scattered. Instead of long-term habitation, the evidence suggests short stays, quick hunts, and frequent relocations. This pattern reflects a life lived in constant adjustment. The Neanderthals who visited these caves were not settling down. They were passing through on the hunt for the next viable patch of land where food was still available. As groups grew smaller, their movements became more unpredictable. They may have followed fewer herds, relying on whatever small game or seasonal plants remained in their shrinking territories. Their technology shows signs of both innovation and simplification. Some tools appear more refined, suggesting that certain individuals pushed their skills to new limits in an effort to maximize efficiency. Others are crude, possibly the result of young or inexperienced members forced into roles once held by more specialized toolmakers who were no longer alive. This uneven craftsmanship tells a story of cultural strain. Neanderthal groups had always relied on skilled artisans to shape their tools. When populations declined, the loss of a single experienced toolmaker could impact an entire community. With fewer adults to teach and fewer children to learn, the transmission of knowledge weakened. Cultural memory became fragile. Traditions that required large groups or coordinated efforts began to fade, not because they were no longer useful, but because there were too few people to sustain them. Food scarcity made life even more difficult. As large animals disappeared from many regions, Neanderthals shifted their diets. Evidence from the final sites shows increased consumption of small game, shellfish, and plant material. This shift demonstrates flexibility, but it also reveals a nutritional challenge. Smaller animals provide less energy and require more frequent hunting. Shellfish offer calories, but depend heavily on seasonal availability and access to coastlines. These dietary changes kept Neanderthals alive, but they could not support growing populations. Climate instability added another layer of uncertainty. Sudden cold snaps or warm periods changed landscapes within a generation. A cave that offered ideal shelter one decade might become too cold or too exposed the next. Water sources dried or shifted, vegetation vanished. Even in refuges that continued to support life, the environment was unpredictable enough that survival became a delicate balancing act. The Neanderthals who lived through these fluctuations learned to expect the unexpected, but each shift pushed their limited resources closer to collapse. Social challenges also grew sharper. With few individuals in each group, the loss of one or two adults could destabilize the entire structure. A skilled hunter lost to injury or illness could mean less food for everyone. A mother lost during childbirth could reduce the community's future. These losses were not just personal tragedies. They were demographic tipping points. In small populations, survival depends heavily on cooperation and shared effort. When numbers drop too low, cooperation becomes harder to sustain. Despite these hardships, there are signs that Neanderthals continued to form intimate social bonds. Some skeletons show healed injuries that would have required long periods of care from others. This indicates that even in their final days, Neanderthals still supported one another. They still tended to the injured, protected the vulnerable, and lived with a sense of community. Their compassion and cooperation did not fade, even as everything around them became more difficult. But compassion could not counter the reality of shrinking populations. Small communities can survive, but they cannot withstand repeated losses. One failed season, one outbreak of disease, or one particularly harsh winter could break the fragile continuity of a group. As more of these small groups vanished, the remaining ones became even more isolated. The loss of each community reduced genetic diversity, cultural knowledge, and the possibility of recovery. Eventually, isolation became the final obstacle. When populations are too small and too scattered, extinction becomes a mathematical certainty. The last Neanderthals did not die because of a single event. They died because their world became too fragmented to support them. Their numbers dropped beneath the threshold needed to sustain future generations. And once that line was crossed, the end came quietly. Yet their story did not end in silence. Their genes had already passed into the rising sapiens population. Their tools remained buried in the earth. Their caves held the ashes of their fires. And modern science continues to uncover the echoes of their final footsteps, revealing not a species that was doomed, but one that endured until it could endure no more. The final disappearance of Neanderthals raises a question that scientists have debated for decades. How could a species that survived hundreds of thousands of years of Ice Age extremes vanish so completely within a relatively short time? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in the interplay of all the pressures they faced. When examined together, these pressures reveal a pattern that transforms the mystery of Neanderthal extinction into a story of population dynamics, ecological limits, and the unforgiving mathematics of survival. One of the most fundamental principles shaping their fate is the concept of minimum viable population. Every species requires a certain number of individuals to maintain genetic health, cultural stability, and the ability to recover from setbacks. When numbers fall below that threshold, a species may appear stable for a short time, but is actually on an irreversible path toward extinction. Late Neanderthal populations were already dangerously small. Many groups consisted of only a few dozen individuals. In such small communities, chance alone can determine survival. A single severe winter could kill enough adults to collapse a group. A mild disease could spread unchecked. A failed hunting season could leave too few calories for reproduction. Each small tragedy multiplied because there were not enough individuals to buffer against it. These demographic vulnerabilities made Neanderthals extraordinarily fragile, even before they faced competition from Homo sapiens. Low genetic diversity intensified this fragility. Over thousands of years, isolated Neanderthal groups accumulated harmful mutations. Many individuals carried long, identical stretches of DNA, a sign that their ancestors had interbred within small circles for generations. This genetic pattern increases the likelihood of health problems, lowers fertility, and reduces resilience to disease. Even if Neanderthals had access to abundant food and stable environments, these genetic challenges would have limited their long-term survival. But the world around them was far from stable. Climate fluctuations disrupted food sources, altered landscapes, and forced constant movement. These environmental swings did not just make hunting difficult, they magnified every genetic and demographic weakness. For Neanderthals, survival required a delicate balance between food availability, group cooperation, and reproductive success. Climate instability tilted that balance again and again until it could no longer be maintained. The arrival of Homo sapiens compounded these challenges. Sapiens populations grew rapidly, and their networks allowed them to spread across vast territories. As they expanded, they occupied prime hunting grounds, gathered resources more efficiently, and adapted quickly to changing conditions. Even without direct conflict, Sapiens reduced the ecological space available to Neanderthals. Two species chasing the same prey inevitably reshaped the landscape. The smaller population lost ground simply because it had fewer individuals to compete. This population imbalance explains why Neanderthals declined even in regions where they survived for millennia after sapiens arrived. A single sapiens group could replace an entire Neanderthal clan simply by reproducing at a faster rate. Over time, the density of sapiens settlements increased. The density of Neanderthal settlements decreased. The shift does not require violence. It requires only time and unequal numbers. As Neanderthal territories fragmented, groups became even more isolated from one another. Cultural knowledge that once passed among communities no longer circulated. When groups disappeared, their skills and traditions vanished with them. Cultural erosion made adaptation more difficult. The shrinking population could not maintain the diversity of knowledge needed to respond to rapid environmental change. At the same time, interbreeding between the two species had indirect effects. When Neanderthal individuals joined sapiens communities, the Neanderthal population effectively lost members. Their genes survived, but their separate identity grew weaker. Mixed offspring often lived within sapiens networks because those networks were larger and more stable. The genetic blending accelerated the demographic decline of Neanderthals as a distinct species. Eventually, these converging pressures reached a tipping point. Neanderthals crossed below the minimum population needed to sustain their lineage. Once this threshold was crossed, even without new threats, recovery became impossible. There were not enough adults to support communities. There were not enough children to rebuild numbers. There was not enough genetic diversity to avoid the accumulation of harmful mutations. The disappearance that followed was slow and quiet. No catastrophe marked their final moment. No dramatic event swept them away. Instead, each generation was slightly smaller than the one before. Each refuge held fewer families. Each hunting season carried more risk. And over time, the curve of their population dropped lower until eventually it reached zero. Their extinction was not an instant event. It was a long decline shaped by the mathematics of small populations and the merging of two human worlds. It happened because their numbers became too small to sustain the complex web of life that had supported them for hundreds of millennia. The final disappearance of Neanderthals can be understood only by examining the whole picture. Every pressure they faced fed into the next, forming feedback loops that gradually weakened their ability to survive. What makes their story so compelling is that no single factor sealed their fate. Instead, extinction emerged from the accumulation of small disadvantages that unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, across thousands of years. One of the most significant of these interconnected pressures was cultural fragmentation. Neanderthal groups once shared techniques, hunting strategies, and knowledge across wide territories. But as their population shrank, points of contact became fewer. When a group disappeared, the knowledge it carried disappeared with it. Innovations remained trapped within tiny pockets and rarely spread far. Without robust cultural exchange, the pace of adaptation slowed. In a rapidly changing world, that slowing became a disadvantage more severe than any single environmental shift. At the same time, the social structure of Neanderthals grew increasingly fragile. In small groups, cooperation is essential, but cooperation requires both time and energy. When survival becomes a relentless challenge, those resources vanish. Instead of building complex shelters or creating symbolic objects, Neanderthal groups were forced to focus on immediate needs. The routines that once strengthened community bonds may have been abandoned simply because there were too few people to sustain them. Resource competition intensified this strain. Even when sapiens did not directly engage with Neanderthals, their expanding presence altered the environment. More hunters meant fewer large animals. More foragers meant fewer edible plants. More settlements meant fewer safe territories. In ecological terms, Neanderthals were squeezed from all sides. They were not outsmarted in a single moment. They were gradually edged out of the landscapes they once mastered. This ecological squeeze had profound demographic consequences. As groups retreated into smaller and more marginal areas, their birth rates declined. Children faced higher risks from cold, hunger, and disease. Mothers carried greater physical burdens. Weak infants had little chance of survival. Over generations, reduced birth rates compounded demographic decline. Even if adult mortality remained constant, a small drop in the number of surviving children could push the population below sustainability. Genetic evidence supports this pattern. Late Neanderthals show signs of inbreeding not just by chance, but by necessity. Surviving groups had so few mating partners that harmful mutations became more common. These mutations lowered fertility and increased vulnerability to disease, intensifying the demographic spiral. Genetic fragility weakened physical health, and weakened health reduced the ability to reproduce. Each generation inherited slightly more risk. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens flourished. Their growing population created a stark contrast. They shared information across long distances. They adopted new survival strategies in response to environmental changes. Their ability to innovate quickly gave them an edge that widened with every generation. Where Neanderthal populations contracted, sapiens expanded. Where Neanderthal culture fragmented, sapiens culture spread. This asymmetry ultimately shaped the fate of both species. The expansion of sapiens did more than outnumber Neanderthals. It shifted the ecological balance of entire regions. Large game was hunted more efficiently. Plant resources were harvested more consistently. Migration routes changed. Even the presence of sapiens as competitors altered the behavior of prey animals, which affected Neanderthal hunting success. These subtle ecological shifts multiplied until Neanderthal strategies became less effective than sapien strategies at nearly every level of survival. Interbreeding also contributed to their decline, not through direct harm but through demographic absorption. When Neanderthal individuals formed families with sapiens, their offspring entered the growing sapiens world. This meant that Neanderthals lost genetic continuity even as their DNA spread. It was not a violent end. It was a gradual blending that erased their distinction one generation at a time. The lineage survived, but the species dissolved. Eventually, the interplay of all these pressures created a point of no return. Neanderthal populations dwindled below the minimum needed to sustain themselves. Even if environmental conditions had improved suddenly, or if sapiens had halted their expansion, the Neanderthal population was already too small to recover. Extinction became inevitable long before the last Neanderthal died. And when that last individual did pass away, there was no ceremony, no final campfire, no record of the moment. Their disappearance left no single mark. Instead, the evidence of their lives simply stopped appearing in cave layers and soil sediments. A species that had endured for hundreds of thousands of years faded quietly from the earth. But the quiet nature of their extinction does not diminish their significance. Their story is preserved in bones, tools, and above all, in the DNA carried by billions of people around the world. Their end was not an erasure. It was a merging of two human worlds, one that shaped the biology and history of Homo sapiens. Their extinction, in the end, is a reminder of how fragile survival can be, and how deeply intertwined our story is with theirs. The disappearance of Neanderthals marks one of the most profound turning points in human evolution. Their final traces fade quietly from the archaeological record, yet the deeper truth is that they remain present in us today. Understanding their extinction is not about identifying a single cause, but about uncovering what their story reveals about survival, adaptation, and the fragile nature of existence. Their absence reshaped the future of the human species, but their legacy continues to echo through our biology and our understanding of what it means to be human. As Homo sapiens expanded across Europe and Asia, they entered territories that Neanderthals had inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. The two species shared the land long enough for cultural exchanges, interbreeding, and interactions that shaped both of their histories. But the pressures of climate change, competition, and demographic imbalance slowly created conditions where only one species could continue to grow. By the time the last Neanderthal groups lived in isolated refuges, the world had already shifted into a landscape dominated by sapiens. The extinction of Neanderthals reveals how vulnerable even the most resilient species can be when the environment changes faster than their cultural and genetic systems can adapt. Neanderthals were masters of Ice Age Europe. They were strong, intelligent, and capable. They endured catastrophic climate cycles for longer than Homo sapiens has existed as a species. But survival does not depend only on physical ability or experience. It depends on population size, adaptability, and the ability to respond to rapid shifts in the world. One of the strongest lessons from their story is the importance of diversity. Neanderthal populations were small and isolated, limiting their genetic and cultural variation. These limitations made it difficult for them to innovate quickly or recover from setbacks. By contrast, sapiens thrived because they lived in larger networks with constant exchange of knowledge and genes. Diversity made them resilient. It allowed new ideas to spread rapidly and enabled individuals to adapt to unfamiliar environments. Another insight comes from the way sapiens and Neanderthals interacted. Their relationship was not solely competitive. It was also cooperative and intimate. They exchanged tools, shared territories, and formed families. Their genes blended in a way that shows their differences were not insurmountable. They were two branches of the human family tree that reconnected before one branch eventually merged into the other. This merging reminds us that human evolution is not simple replacement, but interconnection. Their extinction also highlights the role of chance. A harsh winter, a disease outbreak, or the loss of a single community could have enormous populations for small populations. Many species disappear not because they are inferior, but because events accumulate in ways that push them beyond recovery. Neanderthals likely faced such moments repeatedly in their final centuries. Each narrow escape brought them closer to the edge. Eventually, the challenges aligned in a way that left no path forward. As sapiens grew in number and spread through more environments, they carried with them the genetic gifts of their encounters with Neanderthals. Immune adaptations, metabolic traits, and physical characteristics based on Neanderthal DNA helped early humans survive in regions that would otherwise have been far more dangerous. In this sense, the legacy of Neanderthals became part of what allowed sapiens to populate the entire planet. The archaeological silence that marks the end of Neanderthals is not a sign of sudden collapse. It is the final stage of a long transition in which one human species became absorbed into another through both competition and connection. Their tools vanish, but their genes remain. Their cultural traditions fade, but their influence continues through the paths sapiens took across continents. Their world disappears, yet their trace lives on in nearly every Eurasian lineage. The greatest lesson of their extinction may be that survival is rarely a story of the strongest overpowering the weak. It is a story of which species can adapt fastest to change and maintain the diversity necessary to endure uncertainty. Neanderthals were strong, but their world demanded adaptability more than strength. In the end, the species that could innovate faster, communicate more widely, and sustain larger populations was the one that survived. Yet none of this diminishes what Neanderthals achieved. They survived longer than many species ever will. They mastered some of the harshest climates on Earth. They created tools, cared for their young and their injured, and lived complex lives shaped by cooperation and endurance. Their extinction was not a failure. It was the result of living in a world that grew too unstable and too crowded for their numbers to sustain. Their story offers a window into human vulnerability, but also into human connection. And as we uncover more of their world, we discover how deeply they are still part of ours. The end of the Neanderthals is often portrayed as a disappearance, but in truth, it is a transformation. Their physical presence faded, but their influence radiates across the human species that followed. Understanding this final chapter requires seeing extinction not as an abrupt event, but as a slow merging of lineages, cultures, and survival strategies that ultimately reshaped the human world. As the last Neanderthal communities lived out their final generations in isolated pockets, their world was already being absorbed into the expanding tapestry of Homo sapiens. The two species had shared lands, interbred, and exchanged knowledge for thousands of years. The result was not a conquest, nor a sudden wipeout, but a gradual redirection of the human story. The genes Neanderthals carried for hundreds of millennia became part of sapiens' biology. Their adaptations for survival in cold climates, their resistance to ancient Eurasian pathogens, and even aspects of their physical traits were passed on. These inherited fragments serve as evidence that Neanderthals contributed to the success of Homo sapiens in ways that cannot be measured by fossils alone. Early sapiens entering Europe and Asia were confronted with unfamiliar diseases, harsh winters, and ecological challenges they had never faced. Neanderthal DNA helped them navigate this new world. The success of sapiens across Eurasia was built partly on the biological strengths of the species they would outlast. This interdependence adds a layer of nuance to their extinction. They did not disappear because they had no value. They disappeared because their small populations could not withstand the combined pressures that reshaped their world. Their story reveals something fundamental about human evolution. It shows that survival is not only about strength, intelligence, or endurance. It is also about adaptability, cooperation, and the ability to maintain large, diverse networks capable of spreading culture and innovation. Neanderthals lived in small groups that were deeply connected internally, but isolated from one another. Their communities were resilient in familiar environments, but fragile when exposed to rapid change. Once climate instability, ecological pressure, and population imbalance converged, their world became too narrow to support them. But even in their final centuries, Neanderthals displayed remarkable resilience. They adapted their diets, used new tools, sheltered in coastal caves, and found creative ways to endure environmental instability. Their communities survived far longer than expected under conditions that would have overwhelmed many species. Their disappearance was not a sign of failure. It was the final outcome of a complex interplay of forces that no small population could overcome. The legacy of Neanderthals also challenges long-standing assumptions about human uniqueness. For decades, they were portrayed as primitive or inferior. But modern research reveals that they made art, used pigments, crafted sophisticated tools, and cared for the injured. They lived complex social lives, and their cultural practices carried meaning. The fact that they interbred with sapiens and produced viable offspring shows just how close the two species were. The boundary between them was not as sharp as once imagined. In this sense, the extinction of Neanderthals reflects not the triumph of one species over another, but the merging of two worlds. Their genes became part of the larger human lineage. Their presence shaped the adaptation of sapiens across continents. Their absence created ecological and demographic space for the rapid expansion of the surviving species. Their end marked the beginning of a new phase of human history, one defined by the spread of Homo sapiens across nearly every corner of the planet. The final lesson of the Neanderthals reaches far beyond prehistory. It reminds us that even dominant species can become vulnerable when the world shifts too quickly. It reminds us that population size and cultural diversity are crucial for resilience. And it highlights how interconnected human evolution truly is. Every person outside Africa carries markers of Neanderthal ancestry, silent signatures of a species that shaped our immune systems, our physiology, and perhaps even parts of our behavior. Their extinction was not absolute. It was partial and selective, leaving behind shadows of their biology that still function within us. Every breath, every heartbeat, and every adaptation we inherited from them is a quiet reminder that they were not a distant other. They were part of our story. As we uncover more about their lives and their final days, we come to understand that the question is not why Neanderthals disappeared. The deeper question is how their legacy lives on. They survive in the DNA of millions. They survive in the tools and caves they carved. They survive in the shared ancestry that binds all humans to a past older and more interconnected than we once believed. Neanderthals are gone, but they are not lost. Their story continues every time a living human carries forward a fragment of their ancient world, a genetic whisper from a species that walked alongside us, shaped us, and became part of us.